Let's ultrasound! On today's edition of General Ultrasound, we're diving into the Scanning Mistakes Gallery. On today's episode, Aorta Mistake number 4. Mistake number 4 when imaging the aorta is imaging the incorrect segment of the aorta. It's crucial whenever you're taking an ultrasound image to ask yourself, what is the star of my image? What is the area of interest that I'm truly focusing on? And that's what you want to build your ultrasound image around. First, let's talk about how to make the proximal aorta the star of your image. The first image to the left-hand side represents a diagram of what you should not do when imaging the proximal aorta. This image is focused on the heart rather than the proximal aorta. The proximal aorta runs from the diaphragm all the way to the SMA. So if you cannot see the SMA and the diaphragm both in your image, then you're missing a section of your proximal aorta. If you see an image like this, you need to move more inferiorly to include both ends of your proximal aorta. In the image to the far right, the image is moved more inferiorly. However, this image is now focused on the mid-aorta rather than the proximal aorta. The diaphragm end of the proximal aorta is now missing. Also, it's really crucial when you're imaging the proximal aorta that you be able to see the aorta below the liver. If you cannot see the segment of aorta that's located below the liver, then you're in a different segment of the aorta. For this image, you would want to move more superiorly in the body. The middle image is what the image should look like when you're imaging the proximal aorta. This image not only shows all sections of that proximal aorta, but it's also clearly making the proximal aorta the star of the image. You can see both the diaphragm edge of the proximal aorta. If you can see the back edge of the liver, chances are you can see the back edge of that aorta. And also you can see the SMA end of the proximal aorta. And also note that this image is located entirely below the left liver lobe. And this is what you should see when you're imaging the proximal aorta and really focusing on that proximal aorta as your area of interest. Okay, so we're continuing along with mistake number 4, and this is imaging the incorrect segment of the aorta. And now we're going to talk about how to image the mid-aorta and make that the star of your image. First, let's start with the image to the far right. This image is focused more on the proximal aorta rather than the mid-aorta. The mid-aorta begins at the SMA and it runs down to the renal arteries. So for this image, you need to move more inferiorly or distally along that aorta in order to showcase more of the actual mid-aorta. The middle image is focused more on the distal aorta rather than the mid-aorta. When you can see the vessel beginning to taper and then branch into the common iliac arteries, this is the distal aorta. You need to move more proximally for this middle image in order to image the mid-aorta. The image to the far left is the image that you want to obtain when imaging the mid-aorta. In this image, we can see where the aorta branches into the SMA. Ideally, you want to take the mid-aorta measurement 1 to 2 centimeters past the SMA. If gas obscures the mid-aorta, then you need to take it wherever it's visualized. But in an ideal world, this image to the far left is the image that you are trying to obtain when imaging the mid-aorta. All right, we're continuing along with mistake number 4, and this is imaging the incorrect segment of the aorta. And now let's talk about the distal aorta and how to make that the star of your image. In the first image to the left-hand side, this image is focused on the mid-aorta rather than the distal aorta. The distal aorta runs from the renal arteries to the common iliac arteries. So if you can see the celiac axis and the SMA, you are too far superior and you need to move more distally in that aorta. In the image to the far right, this image is now focused on the tissue that's distal to the aorta, such as the fat and the bowel, and it's also focused on the common iliac arteries, rather than the distal segment of the aorta. For this image, you want to move more proximally in the aorta in order to visualize that distal aorta. The middle image is the image that we should be taking when we're focusing on the distal aorta. This image displays the region where the distal aorta tapers before branching into the common iliac arteries. And this is where you would take your measurement just before it starts tapering. Also note that this vessel is elongated across the image so that you can ensure that your aorta is on axis. This is the image that you want to strive for when imaging the distal aorta. It's important to note, however, that you can't always elongate the aorta completely across the image when imaging this distal aorta. If you can't, you want to strive to make the distal aorta encompass at least 3/4 of the length of your image. This way you ensure that you have covered enough of the proximal end of your distal aorta and that there's not an aneurysm more proximally.